All right, well, today we're going to talk about surveillance technology and specifically policies that governments can implement in order to both provide protections for civil liberties, but also make sure that public safety and efficient operations are happening. And I'm happy to welcome Palo Alto City Councilman Cory Wolbach to join us today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Cory, you've co-authored a colleague's memo and have been really pushing forward on having the city develop some policies that make sense for how we adopt surveillance technology and what kind of data retention and who can have access to data and all that. So we'll take a little bit of a look right now at surveillance technology and how this policy is going to shape up. I'm kind of curious, for starters, what has interested you in this topic in general? What is it that captivates you to be moving on this issue?
Well, thanks for the introduction. I think you summed up some of the key issues already. I've always considered myself a civil libertarian and cared a lot about the Fourth Amendment and other civil liberties. At the same time, there's also a lot of technology that can be used for law enforcement and also for our planning department and other city departments as we move into the future of smart cities, where it might be really useful to pick up some new interesting technology or to use existing technologies in new and different ways. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how do we do our best to protect civil liberties and the privacy of residents and visitors to our city, while at the same time not necessarily precluding city departments from using effective technologies? Mm-hmm. And so it's really finding the balance between those and the marriage between those values that motivated this, right? And so this is really about transparency. This colleague's memo that we wrote about a year and a half ago, and it came to council in April of last year, but we'd actually written it several months before, so that staff had time to review it, think about it, provide some early pre-feedback.
Yeah. So this has been going on for a while.
So we've actually been working on this for about a year and a half already.
Yeah. To what extent was the county effort influential in this process? Because I know Jocelyn kind of led the charge in Santa Clara County with the whole stingray debate, and they adopted a policy about a year ago. Were you kind of viewing that debate and saying, hey, this would be good for Palo Alto, or did you just arrive at this issue separately?
So a lot of people, thanks for the question. A lot of people have been talking about this issue. The ACLU has a model ordinance, which was one of our attachments in our original colleagues memo. I think it's the International Association of Chiefs of Police also has some guidelines on this issue that I included after being forwarded them by former police chief Dennis Burns. And so it's been an area of discussion for people who are interested in civil liberties and law enforcement in particular. I was starting to work on this issue before the county policy went into place. So if anything, I might have seen it as friendly competition, but the fact that the county ended up moving much faster than us, I think is a good thing for Palo Alto, because the county has now implemented something similar to the direction we were heading, and we've seen some of the benefits and some of the challenges at the county level, and so I think it's a good example to learn from and maybe make a couple of tweaks to have the rollout be smoother here in Palo Alto.
I was hoping you could mention some of the challenges. I mean, the benefits I can understand because they're laid out in the benefit. Transparency, have people know what technologies are being adopted before they're adopted. What are the challenges that you could think of with the county implementation of this?
Well, my understanding is that it's, and you'll have to speak to people from the county to get more of an inside scoop, but what I've heard is that there's been a lot of focus on things that are used just inside the county building, inside the county for employees and employees' concerns. And that's not really where our primary focus was in envisioning this. Our primary focus is what do we do to protect the privacy of residents and visitors to the city. I don't know if you want to talk at all a little bit more about what our concept is and where we're heading with this, but that might be a good.
I'm kind of curious, maybe we can lay out for people just at the very basic level, what kind of technologies are we talking about? Because I think we can understand license plate readers or drones because they're very visible. What other things, what other kind of technologies are cities and counties using that could infringe on people's civil liberties?
Right, and so there's really a broad range of technology out there right now, which could be utilized by the city and is utilized by law enforcement or other city departments, around the state or around the country, but more will also be invented in the future. And so we already have at the state level legislation requiring cities to be transparent in how we adopt and utilize automatic license plate readers and stingrays, which basically emulate a cell phone tower and collect a lot of information from your cell phone. That doesn't prohibit us from using them. It just those state laws just require that we have a discussion and approval in a public meeting, and we have a good use policy for how those technologies are used. But those are just a couple of pieces of technology, and there are so many others, and who knows what the next thing to be invented is. So really, the effort we're trying to push here is to say, rather than being reactive to one piece of technology or another and trying to adopt transparency policies for that after the fact, let's just establish a high-level policy that any time the city picks up or starts using anything that's going to raise serious privacy concerns, let's be transparent about that up front. And so this isn't really just about addressing one or two pieces of tech in particular. But to go back to your question, just as a couple of other examples of things that are out there now, potentially drones, body cameras, which I think actually have a lot of benefits for for civil liberties and civil
they can
rights.
show the interaction that occurred.
Yeah.
Not a he said, or she said. Yeah.
Right. And then beyond that, there's also stuff that can be used that is in the digital realm, purely digital realm, like things that help, could help law enforcement identify threats through social media. But again, this raises some concerns.
Yeah.
And also the fact that
tracking.
Also the fact that every police car has 5 cameras right now, and so in the future maybe every police cruiser will have 10 cameras. But I think the practical implications, I thought it was striking when, like in 2015, the police department budget included 90 body-worn cameras, and the subject, I think there was one comment at a finance committee meeting, and it wasn't even brought up when the council was adopting the budget. I'm guessing like that kind of process would be impossible once the new ordinance would be in place. Is that the kind of thing that would trigger a full discussion about do we need body-worn cameras and that kind of thing?
Well,
with the new process?
I think the discussion is almost always good. But as you know, as somebody who sits through our city council meetings and reports on them rigorously,
Operative word, almost. Yeah.
we have a pretty full agenda often, if not always. And so not everything, as you know, requires a full discussion. The idea here is that at least the public and the city council would be informed if the city is going to use something. And prior to getting approval by the city council, that the staff would have done at least a draft of here's what we're going to use, here's why we're going to use it, and here's what we're going to do for this piece of technology regarding data acquisition, data dissemination, and data retention to make sure that we're not unnecessarily infringing on civil liberties and privacy.
So this
it could be on the consent calendar.
Okay.
Right. It could potentially be on the consent calendar, and it's really also about nudging the city departments towards best practices. And I should say, I actually think our city's done a pretty darn good job of this in the past. So for me, this is less about responding to any mistakes in the past, because I think we do a good job. This is really about looking forward and wanting to make sure we have good policies, a good standard operating procedure for considering new technology.
I'm kind of curious, how do you think some technologies could be misused? I mean, what are the things that we're concerned about? How can privacy be violated with some of these pieces of equipment, the data?
Right. Well, so let's look at one of the ones where we already do have legislation, just because it's been very much discussed, and that was license plate readers. An automatic license plate reader can be mounted to a police car or in a fixed location, maybe at the entrance or exit from a parking garage. It can be used for parking enforcement, but it can also, what happens is, an automatic license plate reader can take a picture of every car that drives by an area. And then those can be fed into a larger system. And if you have automatic license plate readers all over the place, they can be in that larger system. It's almost like having a GPS tracker on every car, because you can map out, oh, this car was spotted here, it was spotted here, it was spotted here, it was spotted here. And then, especially with the help of new, more automated technology and more AI, it's easy to, or increasingly easy, to get a picture of what somebody's travel habits are. And, maybe somebody doesn't want to know, want to be public necessarily everywhere that they go.
Yeah, I mean,
And the Supreme Court does, I think, have a ruling that putting a GPS tracker on somebody's car isn't really appropriate without a warrant.
Yeah.
And so that's why the state now has a requirement that we be transparent about how we're going to use license plate readers.
And I think there's an example in one of the police audits from, like, I think it was a few years back, or maybe sometime in the past year. There was an example of an officer with a body-worn camera going with somebody to, like, an emergency room or something, and he could kind of overhear what she was saying about her conditions, and she later alleged that that's like a HIPAA violation. And I don't think there was any intent to violate the HIPAA right, but I think there was some concern right up by the auditor that could be an ancillary result. So I do think I would think it would be wise to kind of consider these kinds of policies before the technologies are adopted. Maybe it's not worthwhile following somebody into an ER with the camera still running, or that kind of things.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think your example brings up kind of an interesting thing, that if you have databases and they're sort of siloed, that's one thing. But the minute you start combining databases, like the DMV knows, who you are, what your license plate is, what your name is. And if you had a license plate reader, they might know your license plate, they don't know who you are, but you combine those two, it's like the power of like grouping many databases and finding out much more specifics about an individual than could ever be known just from a kind of a one-off piece of equipment.
That's absolutely correct. And there's another aspect to this besides data acquisition, data dissemination, data retention. What do we collect? Who do we share it with internally or externally? Maybe with other law enforcement partners at the state or federal level, and then also how long do we keep it? And there's also the question of security, right? Data security, because even if it's important for law enforcement to have certain data for law enforcement purposes, if we're not doing the utmost to protect our cybersecurity around that, it might become available more publicly or available to a hacker. And then again, if you have detailed information about somebody's travel patterns, and that gets into the public, or that gets potentially in the hands of a stalker or something like that, it does raise public safety concerns in and of itself. And that's again why we want to make sure that we're always using best practices around things that have personally identifiable information, or PII as it's often abbreviated.
And I want to go back for just 1 second about the issue of license plate readers, because Palo Alto's had like a couple but hasn't used them that much. But there was actually talk this week at the Planning Commission level to kind of adopt them almost like full force, kind of be the default parking enforcement tool in downtown. This was part of the discussion of the downtown management study, and the consultant actually recommended it, said it would be much more efficient. And it was actually Eric Rosenblum, the Palantir employee, who kind of raised an issue. Well, there might be some, privacy issues associated with that. I'd love to get your take, based on what you know now about license plate readers. Would you support that kind of switch to license plate readers for parking enforcement?
I actually probably would be. But again, it's a question of data dissemination, data retention, and data security in that case, right? I mean, if we're just collecting data about or scanning license plates purely for parking enforcement, do we necessarily need to keep that forever? And do we necessarily need to share that with anyone who asks? And how do we make sure that it's not easily hackable? Those are the questions that we just want to make sure that staff is considering. And again, I think our staff does a pretty good job of that. I think that our police department and our IT department, I think that they are very thoughtful and really progressive in thinking about how technology is used in the city. So I'm not looking to foreclose technological opportunities for the city, just again making sure we use best practices and have transparency for the public as well.
Readers could be okay as long as the proper provisions are in place to make sure you don't hold on to the data for too long.
That's kind of where I'm leaning right now. Again, open to the conversation.
Yeah, I would think with if it's a parking enforcement situation, why would you need to keep any records past 3 hours before? Because aren't you just keep catching people who park too long?
I don't think you would need to, but you never know, why somebody would. It's like,
I don't know the entire system.
If they have the power to do it, it's something that should be concerning whether or not they intend to do it or not. So,
yeah, exactly. So do you think getting to consensus is going to be difficult? I mean, are there extremes in permissiveness versus strictness that are kind of out there in terms of opinion? Because I know people feel very strongly about civil liberties, and some people can be, absolutely sort of against the, I guess you would say, progress of, using technology for public safety. Other people are, we need to catch people who are doing wrong, and, whatever it takes Do you think it's going to be difficult in Palo Alto to come to any kind of consensus around policies and, just
The old Patriot Act debate on a local level.
Well, if I could break that down
Yeah,
into kind
sure.
of two levels,
Yeah.
right? The first level is what we're going for here, which is to set up a standard operating procedure for adopting pieces of technology. And the second level is what do we do with those specific pieces in that higher level context? When it comes to creating that higher level context, that standard operating procedure, getting an ordinance on the books, setting best practices and a procedure for adopting future technology, I think we're going to have pretty good consensus. When we first talked about this on council, when this colleagues memo first came to the council about a year ago, we had people from the ACLU and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Palo Alto residents who were affiliated with both those organizations, and we also had our chief of police at the time, and they all said, this is an important discussion, we should move this forward. Now, when you get to the second level of, once we have that in place, staff comes forward and says, we want to pick up something that maybe was just invented, we think it's going to be useful for reason X, and here's our plan for data acquisition, data dissemination, and data retention, data security for that technology. Then the debates will really depend on the technology and on the uses proposed. I think that's where the debates will happen. But what we're really trying to do here is set up those conversations in a healthy way.
I thought that unanimity is kind of striking given the context of the Santa Clara County debate, which happened just a few months before that, in which there was quite a bit of opposition internally from the DA's office, the sheriff's office. I mean, I feel like Jocelyn really had to win them over, or at least kind of overrule their objection in some ways. It's striking that we haven't seen that in Palo Alto. That, as you mentioned, you had Lieutenant Sheyner at the meeting Tuesday, and he basically said, this policy isn't probably going to hurt us too much. We already do a lot of things because of Fourth Amendment and state statutes to kind of ensure these things. So I do think that is a key point. It's kind of interesting that law enforcement in Palo Alto isn't really talking about this is going to be onerous workload and those kinds of excuses that were given by the opposition at the county level.
Well, I don't really think that's an accident for a couple of reasons. One, I'll take a little bit of credit for along with my colleagues, but the other is as a broader issue. We did talk with staff a lot about this early on and solicit their thoughts and their input. And we've really tried, those of us who wrote the colleagues memo have really tried to work with staff, including our law enforcement and emergency services staff, to be thoughtful of the job that they have to do. And on the broader issue is that as I mentioned before, I think we've got really great staff. I think we, over the years, have established an expectation and have fulfilled that fairly well, that Palo Alto expects the best, and we expect very high caliber thinking about complex issues from our department heads, and from people right down the line, whether it's in technology or in law enforcement. That I think that we do have staff that thinks very comprehensively about the pros and cons of actions that we take. And that our community demands that, and I think that's well understood.
There's one aspect that was mentioned, I'm not sure if it's in the ACLU model surveillance document or what, but the issue of contractors, I think is pretty fascinating, because you can have the entire city staff abiding by certain rules, but then you hire someone to do
Count bicyclers, count cars,
or what have you, and they may not be operating under the same rules, and therefore that seems a little bit like a loophole that kind of needs to be in the umbrella.
Yeah, and so actually what we're trying to get at is a standard operating procedure for adopting technology, whether that's adopted by the city itself or through a contractor or a partner, because if heaven forbid there was an attempt to or technology adopted without regard for civil liberties, whether it's done by the city or by a contractor or by a partner, the effect is the same. The effect is the same, which is privacy of residents and visitors to the city is unclear and may be threatened, and the city has played a role in that.
And to staff's credit, they did put in a provision on the bike counter thing before it was implemented.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
They did like a separate provision just to make sure this will not be used and people will not be identified as just blurry kind of you could see something move through kind of thing.
And I think that
Did you have something to do with that?
well, we had already been talking about this policy with staff at the time that those bicycle and pedestrian counters, that contract came up, and so I do think that there was I think that was actually an example of pushing for this kind of a best practice and standard operating procedure. So an early form in that case.
Well, as we wrap up, can you tell us your hopes for this process going forward? We're at the stage where the staff is going to draft an ordinance for, is it the Policy and Services Committee to look at again? Or?
I actually think that our next step is to go straight to council. Okay. So it's come to Policy and Services Committee a couple of times after the colleagues' memo was referred to PNS by the council a year ago. PNS has had, I think, 2 good discussions about it, and we've now directed staff to write into draft ordinance, bring it to City Council. Then, knowing our City Council, we're likely to pick it apart and talk about it in a thoughtful way, and then hopefully put it on the books. So hopefully within a few months, but I never want to predict a time because then
we're not taking bets here. So
Well,
that's fine.
I eagerly await the annual report. Yeah, we're not taking bets on this one?
We
Okay.
didn't actually mention that, but the idea of an annual report to say what's been used in the city and how has it been used. And
That should be a fascinating document, and it's going to be public, which is great.
Yeah, and again, this is really about transparency and best practices.
Cool.
Great. Well, City Councilman Cory Wolbach, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your being here and explaining the issue to all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate the questions.
Well, that wraps it up for Behind the Headlines. If you want to subscribe to our webcasts and get future notifications, click below. Follow all the news in Palo Alto on paloaltoonline.com. And you can also follow us on Twitter. We're at Palo Alto Weekly. We'll see you next week.